Good morning and welcome to the MGH Department of Psychiatry's 2021 Visiting Day. I'm Patty Ribakoff, Chair of the MGH Leadership Council for Psychiatry, and I am here with my fellow co-chair, Donna Emma, and we are delighted to welcome all of you to the Leadership Council's 10th Annual Visiting Day. Since the Council's inception, this department has been invaluable in helping members navigate the landscape of mental health for family members and friends. The Council has three primary missions: to advance knowledge and treatment of mental illnesses, to reduce stigma, and to promote understanding and compassion for those who suffer. As we all know, nobody does that better than our MGH clinicians. So Visiting Day offers us the opportunity to showcase the latest advances in research and clinical care, learning from the extraordinary MGH psychiatry faculty.
The Leadership Council has supported the work of Mass General Psychiatry since 2007. Council members, and there are nearly 90 of us, are the ambassadors for the department, which has been ranked #1 by US News and World Report for 20 of the last 26 years. Many of us know firsthand why these psychiatrists and psychologists are so renowned. We say this because mental illnesses are amongst the most common health conditions in this country. Many of us know all too well the challenges faced by those who struggle. It is this reality that brings us all together today, and why the Council's motto, "No family goes untouched," continues to ring true.
We are tremendously excited about today's program. The format has been set up as a morning of learning and will unfold in 6 segments. We will begin with not one, but 2 keynote speakers this morning, and they are both rock stars. Dr. Ellen Braaten will first speak on the topic, Keeping Up in a Fast-Paced World, Lessons from Child Psychiatry. Dr. Braaten will be followed by Dr. Stuart Ablon, whose topic is collaborative problem solving, applying neuroscience, common sense, and compassion in our relationships. And then, as we always do, we will conclude with the first half of our program with a compelling patient story.
After a brief break, the second half of our program will feature 3 talks by our amazing faculty. First up is Dr. Jennifer Thomas on the topic, I wish I could eat, but my brain says no, the Neuroscience of Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. Next, Dr. Paula Rauch will speak on what's next, preparing for post-pandemic parenting and grandparenting. And then, can Alzheimer's disease be prevented, is the question that Dr. Yakeel Quiroz will answer for us. We will have a chance to see and interact with each other during the panel discussion, which will follow their informal talks. The future is looking bright, and we are full of hope. We have made it through together with the help of the Chief of Psychiatry, Dr. Maurizio Fava, who assumed his role a mere 5 months before the start of the pandemic. We are grateful for his compassion and optimism, his warmth, and his steadfast and visionary leadership. It is now our privilege to welcome Dr. Maurizio Fava.
Thank you, Donna and Patty, and thank you for your dedicated service as co-chairs of the Leadership Council. Greetings from the Department of Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital. On behalf of all of us, I'm very pleased to welcome you to Visiting Day. Brighter days are finally here. Over 40% of people in the United States are fully vaccinated. Here in Massachusetts, more than 56% are fully vaccinated, one of the highest, if not the highest rate in the country. We're doing so well that the state lifted most COVID-19 restrictions during Memorial Day weekend. Red Sox were allowed to host a full capacity crowd at Fenway Park for the first time since 2019. Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, threw out the first pitch. And Rochelle served as Mass General Chief of Infectious Diseases during the worst of the pandemic. So that moment held special significance for many of us. Of course, it rained that day and the entire holiday weekend because that is the way it is around here. But the rain didn't stop people from going out and reuniting in a long last with the friends and families they have missed so much. And the pandemic has not stopped us from being together. On behalf of all the clinicians in our department, I want to say again how grateful we are for the technology that enabled us to stay connected to our patients and for our ability to pivot and switch from in-person visits to virtual visits so quickly. And I want to say how grateful I am to our faculty for providing the highest quality care during the longest year of our lives. Technology is what will allow us to increase access to care. As you know, access to care is really critical to providing mental health care. Too many people still do not receive the help they need. So as we move forward and navigate the new normal, our department is taking a close look at virtual care and how we can best deliver mental health treatment and services to as many people as possible. Now is a time of transition. We have much work to do. Rates of depression and anxiety are higher now than before COVID, especially among our young people. And I will be calling on you for your support. But it's also a time of new possibility, and we should all be hopeful. I'd like to give you a brief update about the transitions in Mass General. A search committee for the next president of the hospital was recently formed, led by Ann Klibanski, the president and CEO of Mass General Brigham. The committee will start interviewing candidates this month, and we look forward to the process. And over the past year, Mass General Brigham, the parent company of Mass General, has been working on a strategy to build the integrated academic health system of the future. This includes combining some clinical services and operations. The goal is to build more affordable models of care while accelerating innovation through research and education. I am absolutely confident that we'll be stronger together and patients will have greater access and better experience. Rest assured, I will keep in touch with you and provide you with the latest updates. I'm very glad that we're all here today. We have a great morning plan, as Donna mentioned and Patty mentioned. We have 5 terrific faculty presenters. And I also want to acknowledge the 5 faculty who have agreed to participate as moderators for the Q&A sessions that follow each talk. Drs. Jerry Rosenbaum, our Emeritus Chief of Psychiatry, Tim Wilens, Chief of Child Psychiatry, Derri Shtasel, Associate Chief for Public and Community Psychiatry, Kamryn T, Co-Director of the Eating Disorders Clinical Research Program, and Tim Peterson, a leader of the Bullfinch Program. And in particular, I want to extend the warmest of welcomes and our deepest appreciation to Cole Kessler. Our patient speaker will talk about the help he has received from Dr. Braaten and Dr. Peterson. Cole is a success story, and his family should be very proud of him. Before we get started, I want to remind you of the format. A question and answer session will follow each faculty talk. You'll have a chance to ask questions through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Then Dr. Lee Cohen will moderate an informal panel discussion when we all be able to see each other and ask questions to all the presenters. So I hope you will enjoy today's program, and thank you for all the support you provide to our Department of Psychiatry. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Ellen Braaten. Ellen is a renowned psychologist, researcher, author, and speaker. She's one of the world's leading experts in the understanding and treatment of children with learning and attention issues. She is the Executive Director of the Learning and Emotional Assessment Program, or LEAP, at Mass General, and the Kessler Family Chair in Pediatric Neuropsychological Assessment. She's an Associate Professor of Psychology at Harvard Medical School. Ellen has published 4 books, including Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up, a bestseller that was the first to focus on the challenges faced by children with slow processing speed. An accomplished and dynamic speaker, she has made presentations at national and international conferences and parenting groups. She's frequently called on by media outlets for advice on child mental health. Ellen was the first in her family to graduate from college. A special education major, she made a decision at age 30 and as a young mother to pursue her dream of becoming a psychologist. After she earned her PhD in clinical psychology at Colorado State University, she was diagnosed with melanoma, which, in her words, threw her for a loop. It changed her approach to her career and to life. Instead of applying to local schools for an internship, she decided to go for it and apply for the best institutions in the country. And we're very fortunate for that. She was accepted by Mass General and Harvard Medical School, and the rest is history. During the pandemic, she was an invaluable resource to patients and families, but also to the general public. Ellen and the LEAP team have assessed and treated thousands of children and adults. She herself has worked tirelessly to share her expertise, guidance, and wisdom through podcasts, blogs, Twitter chats, interviews and articles in newspapers and magazines, and appearances on TV and radio. We're very grateful to her for all that she's done to see us through. Good morning, Ellen, and welcome.
Thank you for having me today. I'm really thrilled to be here, and that was really quite the trip down memory lane in your introduction, and thank you so much, Maurizio, for such a kind introduction. I'd like to actually ask everyone who's here, and I'm so glad to see so many people here today. I want you to imagine a time in the past, a time before COVID, when we did things like take vacations and attend conferences in person. And the year is 2008. And I am in Hawaii at a psychiatry conference. And like most conferences, it wasn't just about the scientific talks. I found myself having lunch on the beach with the editor of my first 2 books. So she says to me, "We'd love for you to write another book. What do you want to write about? Do you want to write about executive functions, working memory?" "I think I'd like to write a book about processing speed," I said. Now, my editor has published dozens of books, some of the most popular books on all sorts of topics related to psychology and psychiatry. And she said to me, "Processing speed? I've never heard of it." No one really had at the time. And to be honest, I had some trouble explaining it to her myself, but I tried. And here's what I said. So processing speed is how long it takes someone to do something, to take in information, to process it, and then generate a response. In neuropsychology, we can measure it by how long it takes someone to, for instance, copy a code in a given period of time or quickly do a page of multiplication facts. It's not what any of us would think of when we think of intelligence, but our culture values it so much. It values speed so much that it actually is included as a factor on IQ tests. My editor said, "So why is this important?" I said, "Well, 2 reasons. One, our world is moving so fast that many kids are having trouble keeping up. But for the kids who are vulnerable, it's even more of an issue. The kids who have ADHD or anxiety or a learning disability such as dyslexia, those kids who have a slower rate of processing seem to have an even bigger disadvantage. Their parents and teachers don't know how to help them. They aren't as responsive to treatments when they're younger. And as they're entering college and adulthood, they're not as successful as their peers who don't have that one difference in their profile." then my editor said, well, it sounds more like an article than a book, but see what you can do about it. So I set off to see what I could do. And what I'd known up to this point was just my clinical experiences and a hunch about this group of kids. I set out to find nearly every article I could on the topic. There were around 12 articles that were useful. Now, while there were many studies on adults, older adults in particular, who had problems with speeded processing, there was almost nothing on kids. We know that in adulthood, slowing down is something important to monitor as we age. It's associated with all sorts of issues related to living independently and our mental status. But as a field, we didn't think it worth studying in kids. Now, by the time I figured out that there was almost nothing known about this topic, I had gotten myself into a pretty tight spot. I was now committed to writing a book about something that really was more of a magazine article than a book. Luckily, though, around this same time, the MGH Psychiatry Department opened up a new program for assessing children with learning and emotional issues, LEAP. And our vision for this program included a data repository. Many children who are evaluated in a clinic like ours come for reevaluations, and their evaluations need a tremendous amount of data. It provided a perfect opportunity to study children, not just at one point in time, but over the course of their development. Now, before I get to what we learned about this group of kids, I want to make sure you understand who these kids are. If you have a child or a grandchild with slower processing speed, you probably already know what I'm talking about. The child who takes forever to do his homework, can't make up his mind about what he wants for breakfast. When her mom tells her it's time to get in the car, she finds that she hasn't even started to get ready 15 minutes later. At one point, we would have thought that all of these kids were ADHD, and many of them are, about 60% according to our research, but many aren't. And what does it feel or look like for the kids themselves? I like to use the example of Lucille Ball in the Candy Factory, and I don't think many of us remember this except in reruns. But remember, Lucy is on a conveyor belt in a candy factory, and she's supposed to be wrapping each particular piece of candy as it comes down the conveyor belt. The candy's coming too fast. She can't keep up. So what does she do? Well, she copes in the best way she can. She starts to stuff the candy in her mouth, her pockets. She puts it in her hat. It's really funny to watch in a comedian. Not so funny when you're 9 years old, unable to keep up with the pace of the classroom. And when your way of coping is stuffing the homework you couldn't finish in the bottom of your backpack so no one sees it. Now, by the time that 9-year-old is 16, he's out of ways of coping. Maybe he's anxious. Maybe he's numbing his pain by smoking marijuana. Maybe he wants nothing to do with the world of work at all. The studies we've done over the last 12 years has helped us better understand this subgroup of kids. Here are some of the things we've learned. It's a neurocognitive profile that's associated not just with ADHD, but also with anxiety, autism, and more significant psychiatric symptoms. Slower processing can affect children's social relationships, their ability to do well in certain subjects, particularly math. It can lead to poorer parent-child relationships. For most kids, it doesn't get better with age. It seems to affect boys more than girls, which can be one reason why we're observing many boys having such difficulty making a seamless transition into adulthood. Now, I had hoped that my research on this topic would be useful in understanding and knowing how to best treat these kids. But what surprised me was how much this topic resonated with parents and teachers of many kids. I started getting calls from people all over the world who read my book, thinking that it applied to their child, when actually it wasn't meant to. It was then that I realized this area of research collided with 21st century child rearing practices. At the intersection of it was this: the pace of our lives isn't in line with the pace of childhood. We also tend to think of average as pejorative. Who wants an average child? Well, let me tell you a secret. Most of us have average children, and our kids know it before we do. Average defines most of us. It's the definition itself. It's most people. Only 5% of the population could be in the top 5%. But even if we know this and we believe it, we live in a world where extraordinary, or at least the delusion or the aspiration of being extraordinary, trumps ordinary. In order for kids to live up to these expectations, they need to try harder, they need to do more, and they need to do it faster. And so what do we do then? Well, we praise their efforts, we give out lots of awards, we rely on external approval, something that doesn't really work very well in motivating kids. And you're going to hear about this in just a little while from Dr. Ablon. We don't rely enough on encouragement, which gives non-evaluative feedback as to how a child is doing by saying things like, I see you're a child who doesn't give up, or you behave very kindly to your friend just there. And even more, there are more options for kids, more things to process. Too many choices makes children less likely to engage in their final selection. In psychology, we call this choice paralysis. More choices make it less likely for us to take action. For kids who take longer to process and make decisions, it's really very difficult. And there are signs that this time crunch may be affecting more kids than I had originally thought. Anxiety has outpaced depression in children, and the rates are increasing every year. When we ask kids to keep up in a speeded up world, we deprive them of well-being and resilience. You can't be resilient if you literally can't do what you're asked to do. Resilience is that capacity to recover quickly when we hit roadblocks in life, or at least the ability to know that we have the power to affect change in our world. And many kids realistically know they can't. These issues lead to particularly tragic ends for children who are already vulnerable, and particularly those who are vulnerable due to slower processing. Now, this is the point in our conversation where you're probably asking yourself, so what do we do? I wish I had a nice, concise answer, but I do have some good news about this particular subgroup of kids. Over the past decade, this field has exploded. It's very much in line with the notion that diagnoses aren't in strict categories that we once thought them to be. This processing speed trait appears to be an important marker across a number of conditions. In 2002, there were 9 articles that mentioned processing speed in children. In 2019, there were 225 articles for which it was featured. In fact, while I could only find a handful of articles on the topic when I started writing this book 12 years ago, since 2010, there have been over 1,600 articles focused on this topic. I'd like to think our work had something to do with that. Now, in terms of how to help this group of kids, there's a lot more we need to know. Medication can be helpful in treating the symptoms of ADHD and anxiety, but we don't yet have medications to treat the processing speed itself. We can provide treatments for the comorbid conditions, CBT for anxiety or depression, reading treatments for dyslexia. When I see a child who has slower processing speed, I know that we need to be more aggressive with treatment and we need to start it early. That concept seems obvious now. It wasn't 10 years ago. One of the most powerful tools we have is self-awareness. Knowing ourselves is a protective factor. It allows us to develop proactive compensatory strategies. Self-awareness allows children to seek assistance when needed and to avail themselves of educational and employment opportunities that build on their strengths and not just their weaknesses. Understanding ourselves, understanding the challenges of the world we live in, having discussions with the children in our lives who struggle with this and other issues, talking about these issues as differences that need to be understood and not things to be ashamed of. This is one of the most important things we can do. Later this morning, you'll hear about this and how it's played out in the life of a young adult. Students who persist in college aren't always the smartest ones or the ones who excelled academically in high school. Other skills like optimism, resiliency, social agility become more important as we age. Kids who have had challenges and who have successfully learned to manage them are actually more successful than those who haven't had those challenges. They've experienced recovering from things like bad grades to social challenges. They know what it means to bounce back. I've learned a lot from studying kids who take longer to do things, and much of what I've learned won't make it into a scientific journal. I've learned that boredom is a gift we don't give our kids nearly enough. Okay, well, maybe we've had a little bit too much boredom over the last year and a half, but there really are some good things about boredom. These kids, they like boredom. They're cool with taking their time. It's us who aren't. Slowing down is something we talk about, but we don't take the time to learn from the kids who naturally have the ability and temperament to teach us about it. Appreciating the ordinary, the things that go on in our life that we miss when we're focused on speed. Appreciating those simple, ordinary things is actually something pretty extraordinary. Overall, I've learned that when the world of research collides with the larger world, it leads to greater understanding of both. And on that, I will thank you so much for giving me the opportunity today to share this with you, and I would love to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was fantastic. I'd like to give the opportunity for people to ask you questions using the chat function. If you can just type any question you want. But let me start with a question, because I've seen over the years, having coached both soccer and basketball, the classic phrase, pick up this pace, pick up the pace. Do you think that picking up the pace is overrated? At the end of the day, we're contributing to anxiety, with the kids. And at the end of the day, these kids have, strength that can, easily compensate if you give them enough time. So do you think that that phrase should be abolished? I do.
And I know Stuart will be talking about this because he usually does in his talk, that when we ask somebody to do something that they can't do. So we're talking in this case about a neurocognitive profile. There are some people who just can't run any faster. And so when we ask them to pick up the pace and they're not capable of doing that, and we don't give them ways to compensate for that, it does lead to increased anxiety, or they start to just not care. So that's what I find is either one of the two things happen by the time an adolescent, a child reaches adolescence. So I don't think that's a very good or a very wise statement to use. For most of us, even who don't have weaker processing speed, when somebody says, hurry up, we're never like, oh, thank you for that piece of advice. So, and for those of us who are vulnerable, it can make us really anxious and to lead to sort of chronic anxiety. And these kids hear that all the time from their friends, their parents, their teachers, all day, every day.
There's a question. Thank you, Dr. Braaten. How do we get schools and educators to better understand and accommodate these children with slow speed processing?
So what I've found over the last 10 years is that sometimes the parents have to be the educator. And because nobody, really thought that this was an important piece of a child's neurocognitive profile. It's just like, yeah, well, he's slow at writing, so who cares? We didn't realize it was associated with all of these other kinds of psychiatric issues. So sometimes you need to be the ones to become educated yourself and share it with the teachers. I have found that there have been hundreds of situations where the parent was the one to make a big difference in not just a school, but a school system. So sharing the information that you've learned today, getting informed can make a real difference. And there is a lot there's a lot of information. If you just Google processing speed, you'll find a lot of things from the MGH Clay Center website and other websites that are very reputable and a real source of great information.
Thank you so much, Ellen. By the way, I gave you the wrong instructions. The question should be typed in the Q&A and not the chat, but you figured that out without my telling you. So great job, Kate, Jonathan, and Sonia. So let's move to the second question. How do you recommend helping children who acknowledge their slow processing speed, and how to overcome this as a way to motivate them? Many of the most successful people I know have overcome similar obstacles and found their skill sets as adults.
So I think that what's changed, I totally believe that. I think that a lot of the brightest and most innovative people in our culture have this processing speed issue, because being able to take time to think about a big problem is an advantage. And so that's a great thing. The problem is that now in our current educational system and our current lives, those kids aren't making it into adulthood. So one of the biggest issues to treat this is to actually understand it and to acknowledge that, yes, it takes you longer to do things, and to know. I've had many parents come to my office and say, so it's just going to take my son longer to do something? And I said, yeah. It's like, oh, that's helpful in and of itself. Now, in terms of how to treat it, one of the things you want to make sure you do is to know every other comorbid issue that is there. So if there's a reading disability, you want to fix every single thing that we can fix: anxiety, depression. Make sure that we're treating those other issues as, aggressively as possible. But some of the other things that I find are helpful is teaching kids a sense of time. An associated research track that we've been looking at is time perception in kids with ADHD and also processing speed issues. And what we found is a lot of kids with ADHD have poor time perception, not time management, but time perception. So they don't really perceive what 15 minutes feels like versus 30 minutes, which is why they often will say, oh, I can get that done. Not because they're overly hopeful, but they actually don't understand how much you can get done in a given period of time, because they're actually sort of blind to the concept of time itself. We think that kids with slower processing speed particularly have this issue. So they will, for example, need 15 minutes to do a 5-minute homework assignment, and they'll think they can do it in 2 minutes. They don't have that. So teaching them a concept of time, infusing that into your daily life, teaching kids how to read an analog clock, timing how long it takes to get from one place to another. Those sorts of things are actually teaching them to monitor time, which helps them understand how long it's going to take them to get something done, and helps them also to not have as many of the social and other issues that go along with not being able to complete things.
Thank you. Another question. In your experience, have you found a change in school type could lend itself to a slower pace? Are there other things that you have seen implemented to optimize the environment with someone with a lower, slower processing speed?
Absolutely, some kids do better in some certain schools. And I really don't feel like there's a one kind of school fits all for all kids, any kind of child. So yes, the answer to the question is yes. I also think that within schools, different teachers respond better to learning differences and can incorporate that. So I think the things to look for in a school environment are schools that acknowledge and that actually like diversity in their school population, neurodiversity, not, all kinds of diversity, and value that. They don't just talk about it, but really value that. A school that is very much research-based in terms of educational curriculum ideas, that is going to be the kind of school that when you say, or when you ask them to incorporate different information that you might have gotten from a neuropsych report or a psychiatry evaluation, that the school is going to respond. So what you really want to do is look for a school that collaborates with their parents and that is able to incorporate the sorts of things that you're saying. Simple things that we can do is to give kids more time to be able to complete tests, do assignments, modify assignments, but also keeping things as simple as possible. The more stress a child has, the more we slow down. And I say we, because that happens with all of us. It's a natural response. When we're stressed, we sort of grind to a halt. So keeping the stress level as low as possible is going to help all of us become more fluent and to be able to react in quicker time.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Another question is, are you familiar with the diagnosis of PANDAS? Is there a component of processing delay that comes with it?
I don't really know the answer to that question, but I would say probably, because, and that's something that we actually have thought about exploring. But kids with pandas have oftentimes very severe OCD. Well, that oftentimes comes with a slower speed of processing. The reason for it is probably different than when we're talking about kids who have that sort of developmental processing speed, because the slower processing probably comes more from the tendency to be obsessive. And so they're slowing down for a different reason. But the features and what's happening probably in social relationships and in their ability to be successful in a classroom environment are probably very similar. The reasons are different, I think.
So another last question. Do you think that having slower processing speed helps you develop a greater emotional intelligence? You know, greater empathy, greater ability to understand others. What do you think of that?
I actually do. I think that having worked with these kids for now, 10, 15 years, I absolutely think that is the case, because they have this natural tendency to sort of understand what's going on in the world in a minute sort of way. So I think they do have an awful lot to teach us. And I think it's it's an asset in a lot of careers. It's an asset in life. And we're all, what do we talk about more than almost anything is how do we slow down in life? We're always going to the yoga retreats or the spas or we're doing all these things to help us slow down when we've got people living among us who do that naturally. And we need to value that quality in them and not pathologize it.
And I just want to comment, Jonathan said, I think it's key to, it's not a question to you, but I think it is key to keep children looking into the future while staying grounded in the present. There is a reason that the windshield of a car is bigger than the review mirror. The view. Anyway, well, thank you so much, Ellen. That was fantastic. Really appreciate your telling us about this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let me move on to introduce Dr. Jerry Rosenbaum. Jerry needs no introduction. Jerry served as the chief of psychiatry from 2000 until 2019 and is now a psychiatrist-in-chief emeritus and director of the Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Disorders, director of the Center for Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Mass General, and the Stanley Cobb Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. As you all know, he's been a phenomenal leader of our department for 19 years, and he now continues to be on the cutting edge with his work in psychedelics and in anxiety. His research career is focused on mood and anxiety disorders with an emphasis on pharmacotherapy for those conditions. So it's a great pleasure to introduce my mentor and the person who's been behind the successes of our department for the past 20 years, Dr. Jerry Rosenbaum.
Well, thank you, Maurizio. That was very kind and generous. And hi, everybody. It's nice to have so many friends back with us for visiting day. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Stuart Ablon, who is the director of our Think Kids program. This is a program founded at Mass General that teaches a revolutionary but evidence-based approach for helping children with behavioral challenges. Through collaborative problem solving, Think Kids promotes the belief that challenging kids lack the skill, not the will, to behave well. Stuart has trained many thousands of parents, educators, and clinicians throughout the world in the collaborative problem solving approach. Stuart is the Thomas T. Stenberg Endowed Chair in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and is an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. He's the author of the books Changeable, The Surprising Science Behind Helping Anyone Change, Treating Explosive Kids, the Collaborative Problem Solving Approach, and the School Discipline Fix. He has also written numerous articles, chapters, scientific papers on the process and outcome of psychosocial interventions. He received his doctorate in clinical psychology from Berkeley and completed his pre-doctoral and postdoctoral training at Mass General and Harvard Medical School. My relationship with Stuart is both personal and professional. I first met him when he was a recent college graduate working as a research assistant on studies that Joe Biederman and I were doing together. Stuart not only was our research assistant, but he helped coach my eldest son in tennis and helped him follow in Stuart's footsteps as a small college tennis player. Stuart, I knew him before as a graduate student, and then he returned as a junior faculty member. And even then, he was always at the forefront of his field. In his doctoral level research, he explored what psychotherapies had in common, looking at analysts and CBT therapists, and determining what was really helpful about what different types of therapies offered. In 2004, Stuart pitched the idea of using the collaborative problem-solving approach at Mass General, and over time, with his leadership, Think Kids has become a national resource and a national model, and the source of teaching and training about this method. His skills as a therapist, a teacher, and a trainer are really, really exceptional, and his work continues to change the narrative on how kids' conditions are understood and treated. Quite simply and profoundly, he is making the world a better place. So I'm honored and delighted to welcome Dr. Stuart Ablon.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. It's an incredible privilege to have actually been a part of this department now for 29 years, believe it or not, with a few-year interruption there after being Jerry's research assistant right out of college. And like Maurizio said, Jerry is an incredible mentor to so many people. And I think our work and our program at Think Kids is a pretty typical, honestly, example of how Jerry really sparked so much innovation in our department. So many people, you just heard a wonderful example with Dr. Ellen Braaten, my colleague, so many people in the department spotting a problem, researching that problem, coming up with some innovative solutions and studying them. And if they prove effective, really trying to bring them to scale. And I think that's what we've done over the past 25 plus years, and it's been an incredible privilege to do it. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to giving you a little bit of an overview of this work. For me, it really started with sort of feeling unsettled about the fact that there's this conventional wisdom about kids who struggle with their behavior. And that conventional wisdom basically suggests that kids who behave poorly are unmotivated to behave better, that in essence, they're behaving poorly because they're trying to get stuff or get out of stuff with their behavior. And that, of course, leads adults around them, parents, teachers, clinicians, all kinds of people. It leads adults to try to respond to challenging behavior by motivating kids to behave better, using rewards, punishments, carrot and stick approaches, all flowing from the notion that these kids are simply unmotivated to behave well. And that didn't sit so well with me when I was working with these kids, because one of the things I saw is these kids were miserable and the adults around them were incredibly frustrated. And this was not a pleasant way to live for these kids. They felt awful about things. And it just struck me that if all these kids needed was motivation to behave well, we don't need those rewards and punishments, because these kids have all the intrinsic motivation in the world to behave better because their lives feel so miserable. And at the same time, even in, I think the first published paper I was ever on with Dr. Joseph Biederman and Dr. Rosenbaum was beginning to show that kids who struggled with their behavior had a lot of other things going on at the same time. And so the conventional wisdom and how we treated these kids really didn't fit with what emerging research was saying, ours and other people, and it really didn't make much sense. It just wasn't common sense. And so for the last 25 years, what I've done is tried to study these kids, work with these kids, and what's become very clear, as Jerry suggested, in the introduction is these kids, they don't actually lack the will to behave well. What they lack are the skills to behave well, literally neurocognitive skills, skills like flexibility, frustration tolerance, problem solving. And one of the things we've seen in the last year is something we've actually known for some time as well. And that is that when kids, or anybody else for that matter, are exposed to chronic stress, that delays skill development. And Dr. Braaten talked about this earlier. The other thing is it makes it harder to access those skills. And we've all seen this during the pandemic, which has required much more flexibility from us all, much more frustration tolerance, and has asked us to be better problem solvers. Now, ironically, though, in many cases, right when we needed those skills the most, they were the hardest to find, because under stress, we humans, we get dysregulated, and we have a hard time accessing skills that, by and large, are performed by our prefrontal cortex. Now, what we've done over the years is we've said, okay, look, if we understand that this is about skill, not will, then we need different approaches to not only understand these kids, but to help these kids. So we developed an alternative approach that we call collaborative problem solving. And it's based on the assumption that these kids lack skill, not will. And the solution is not to motivate more compliance using mechanisms of power and control, but instead to try to help these kids develop the skills that they lack. And I say kids, but the interesting thing is that this work has grown over time. So it's applied across the lifespan now, wherever you see challenging behavior. And it all flows from this underlying notion of behavior being determined by skill, not will. And in fact, we have a philosophy behind our work based upon that. And the philosophy is a simple one. Applied to kids, it goes like this. Kids do well if they can. Not kids do well if they want to. We just got to make them want to. But kids do well if they can. If a kid could do well, they would do well. And if they're not doing well, you know what? We've got now almost 50 years of research in the neurosciences that tells us what's getting their way. Let's work off of that. And that philosophy, which can be applied to us adults too, people do well if they can. If you hold on to that philosophy, it'll help you to have empathy for others when they behave in challenging ways. And empathy has tremendous power. It's not just a nice way of being in the world, it's tremendously effective, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And I'll share one quick story from what I think is of often the most difficult circumstance that we worked in, which is with the New York City Police Department, who have over 5,000 uniformed officers and agents in the New York City schools. Yes, over 5,000, about 5,500, which, by the way, would make the third largest police force in the United States of America, just the cops in the schools. And we were called in to work with them because the cops were being assaulted at alarming rates. And of course, when they were assaulted, they would arrest the kids. And this is right there, what it has been referred to as the school to prison pipeline. And by the way, a pipeline that disproportionately affects students of color. Now, when we were asked to work with them, we made the mistake of trying to train 1,000 cops at a time. And I remember when I first was training the cops, my first couple of go-arounds, they just were not buying the notion that this was about skill, not will. And I remember one particular day, I think it was after the second day, training another 1,000 people, and it was going horribly, to be honest. They were very unruly, disrespectful. They were completely dysregulated. It was ironic. But this one gentleman, he said, he raised his hand and he said, you know what? You seem like a nice guy, but I got to tell you something. The behavior that we get called in to deal with, it's dangerous, it's disrespectful, it's inappropriate, and it must stop. And here you come in making excuses for these kids' behavior. Well, I said to myself, all right, there's no way I'm going to teach these folks that this is about skill, not will, and engender more empathy if they're this dysregulated themselves. So I did what any good teacher would do. I went home to my hotel room that night and I changed my slides and I made a new slide. And the slide said, explaining is not excusing. And right before I started talking about this being about skill, not will, I said, hey, I'm not excusing this behavior. I'm just explaining it. And you know what? It made no difference whatsoever. The next 1,000 cops that I was trying to train completely dysregulated as well. They weren't buying it. So finally, I decided, you know what, I ought to practice what I preach and start with empathy. And so the next day, I kicked it off by just saying, hey, you know what? I want to be clear about something. The behavior that you all get called in to deal with, it's dangerous, it's disrespectful, it's inappropriate, and it must stop. And you could hear a pin drop in that auditorium. And I said to them, and you know what? If we're going to stop it, we better know what's causing it. Because how are we going to stop something that we don't know if we don't know what's causing it? Or if we think what's causing it is wrong. And we got to stop it because it is dangerous. It is disrespectful. It is inappropriate. And you know what? It was like you could see the cops' cortexes open up in front of me. They were ready for business. And to me, what this taught me is the power of empathy. Empathy regulates. And I think it's particularly important to point out on the heels of the last few years, this is proof positive, and there's neuroscience behind this. Words matter. You can use your words to regulate or dysregulate someone, or frankly, thousands of people, millions of people. And we were able to regulate those cops and then to teach them. And what they were able to do then is through empathy and compassion with the kids, they were able to regulate the kids. That following school year, across 1 million students in the New York City Department of Education, we saw a 40% reduction in assaults, nearly 60% reduction in arrests, and 70% reduction in summonses issued. Talk about interrupting the school to prison pipeline. A local colleague, a psychologist who studies the brain, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, would not be surprised by this because one of the things she talks about is the same part of the brain that's responsible for processing language is actually the part of our brain that helps us regulate all aspects of our body, our heart rate, our breathing, our blood pressure. She talks about the social responsibility that comes along with this because in essence, we are caretakers of each other's bodies and nervous systems. We have the ability through empathy, through words, to regulate one another. Now, having said that, empathy can't be the only thing you do, because the reality is what happens when we have a different point of view, a different perspective, when we have a concern that we need met. And this is where what we call collaborative problem solving comes in. Because what we teach people is 3 simple ingredients. The first ingredient is empathy. It's asking questions, taking guesses, reflecting what you've heard, being a detective to try to understand somebody's perspective. But once you understand theirs and they're regulated, then you can share your concern, your perspective. And you know what? Empathy doesn't mean agreeing or disagreeing. It means understanding. You can have a different point of view. But once you understand that person's point of view, that's the time to share yours. And you know what? They're going to be a lot more receptive to understanding yours if you've understood theirs first. And once you have 2 sets of concerns on the table, you go to the final, the third of those 3 ingredients, and invite them to collaborate. Invite them to try to come up with solutions that address both parties' concerns. And I'm going to take you back to the NYPD for an example. A girl in high school who has a note from her mom. She's got a doctor's appointment. She's got to leave school 1 period early, and she's running a little bit late. Unbeknownst to anybody else at school anyways, this is a very important appointment because this is to verify whether her home pregnancy test that suggested she was pregnant was in fact accurate. She goes flying out of school, gets to the corner and realizes she forgot her bus pass. She runs back, throws her backpack into the thing that goes through the side of the scanner, and she is about to try to run through the metal detector there. And the cop stops her at the door and says, whoa, hold on a second. I'm sorry, I can't let you back in. Once you've left school grounds, you're not allowed back in. That's the rule. She starts to escalate, saying, I just need my bus pass, screaming at the officer. And the officer, who previously would have simply reminded her of the consequences of her potential actions here, instead uses empathy. Starts with empathy. All right, hold on a second. I hear you. You need your bus pass. I want to help. My concern is just that I'm not allowed to let you back in. Otherwise, I lose my job. I want to keep my job and keep everybody safe. She starts to escalate. He goes right back to the first ingredient to re-regulate her. I get it. I hear you. I hear you. You need to get your bus passed. I get it. And I just want to keep everybody safe and follow the rules. What can we do? Third ingredient. So that you get your bus pass, we follow the rules. And to be honest, it's not hard to come up with a solution, including the one that they did, which is to get one of her friends who actually knows her code for her locker or combination to get her bus pass. Problem solved, assault avoided, arrest avoided, relationship built as well. And you know what? Those three ingredients that can be used in the most difficult circumstances, they can be used anywhere. This thing works throughout the world. You can use it in any relationship, these three ingredients, at work, at home, with friends, with relatives. And there's a couple of reasons it works. Reason number one is that these three ingredients in that order, they actually mirror how our brains process information. Because we process information from the bottom up. You've got to regulate somebody before they're going to relate to you, before you can reason with them. Too often we make the mistake of trying to reason with a dysregulated person. You've got to regulate first, then relate, then reason. It's literally moving up the brain. First ingredient, regulates. Second ingredient is where you're relating to each other. Third ingredient is where you're basically saying, hey, let me talk to your cortex now, the smart part of your brain, now that we're both regulated. And you know what? As we've seen in all the settings we've worked in, if at any point in this process, somebody goes brainstem on you and gets dysregulated, you just go back to that first ingredient, empathy, to re-regulate them before you start moving up the brain. The other reason that this works is because our research has shown something pretty cool, which is that when we engage in this process with other people, we help them practice neurocognitive skills. Whoops, that's my timer telling me that I got to stop here.
You want to wrap up there, Stuart?
Yeah, I'm going to wrap up. That's some cute music. It's reminding me to stop here. The other reason this works is because when people practice this, it actually builds skill. Our research has shown that when adults and kids, or adults and adults for that matter, practice these three ingredients together, both parties practice all kinds of skills related to problem solving, flexibility, and frustration tolerance. We literally change the brain. So, my final moment here, let me just share a few take-homes with you. Remember, this is about skill, not will. People do well if they can. We're all doing the best we can with the skills we have to handle what the world is throwing at us. If you embrace that notion of people do well if they can, it'll help you stay regulated, stay calm, be empathic. Remember, our words matter. Words can be used to harm, but they can also be used to help, to regulate. Start with regulation, then relate, then reason. And the last thing I'll share for now is apply this philosophy to yourselves. Go easy on yourself. Remember that people do well if they can includes you, it includes me, includes all of us. Apply that empathy to yourself. So it's not just kids do well if they can, it's parents do well if they can, it's teachers do well if they can, friends, relatives, partners, colleagues. People do well if they can. Hold on tight to that philosophy, and it'll help you to remain in an empathic position, which is not just the kind way to be, it's a more effective way to be.
Thanks, Stuart. That's really great. And the wisdom in that is incontrovertible. But you kind of anticipated my first question, which is, when a kid is really out of control, you have empathy in a funny sort of way, which is you get out of control too. You're in a public place, your kid's misbehaving, screaming, not listening to you, you get upset. And of course you add fuel to the fire, you make a bad situation worse. Is there any way to, besides, believing what you've just said and knowing the truth, to avoid getting out of control oneself so that you can apply the wisdom?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think what you're pointing out, Jerry, is something very important about dysregulation, and it's that it's contagious. I mean, all it takes is one dysregulated person for the other person to get dysregulated, and that's how things get ugly. But one thing we know from from parent-child research in infancy is that regulation is also contagious. So if we adults can manage to stay calm, something called co-regulation occurs, where it's more likely that a kid is going to become regulated. But as you're pointing out, Jerry, this is easier said than done.
You're motivating us rather than giving us the skills.
Well, here's the skill. This is the second part of what I was going to say. That meltdown that occurs, it doesn't happen out of the blue for no apparent reason. With kids who struggle with specific skills, it's predictable circumstances in which the challenges occur. And parents who are a part of this meeting now, you know when it is, whether it's trying to get your kid off of screen time up in the morning to do work, to get on Zoom, whatever it is, to go to bed. These are predictable difficulties.
So know the triggers and anticipate it before it escalates.
Yeah, and Jerry, and just if I can add one thing, do the 3 ingredients proactively, not in the heat of the moment in the grocery store or whenever what's going on. You know it's going to happen. Sit down when the kid is calm and regulated and start those 3 ingredients to proactively problem solve.
Yeah. We've got an endorsement from Tangley, who says, I'm a huge believer in what you profess. I have become a better listener, grandmother, and therapist with your guiding principles. Your workshops are fantastic. Just want to thank you for your incredible expertise and fun presentations. And I certainly endorse that. I always wonder, every time I listen to this extraordinary story of Think Kids, what it is about humans when they have power over others, they so often default to punishment rather than remediation. I don't know, maybe that's in our natures. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it gets right to what we were just talking about before, which is when we get dysregulated, we feel out of control. And particularly if there's a power differential, because we feel like that person is sort of threatening our power. We feel disrespected, we feel ineffective. And when that happens, we grab for control back. And so these punitive responses really come from our frustration and also our inability to think about what else to do. I actually think if we teach kids how to do this, there'll be a generation of adults that fall back on these things more often. Because to be honest, most of us are taught that the way to handle a problem is the bigger, stronger person's concerns and perspectives are going to win out. And I think we can shift that.
And does all this then have meta implications on the societal level for what we're going through in terms of our national reckoning on social and racial justice and the power imbalance and tensions between groups?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think it's one of the things we're spending a lot of time doing now at Think Kids related to our diversity, equity, and inclusion focus is thinking about how we can use collaborative problem solving to promote cultural responsiveness, because there's a fair amount of cultural humility really built into collaborative problem solving, because the whole basis of the model is saying, you know what, you don't know what somebody else's perspective, point of view, or experience is. You have to ask, you have to listen, you have to gather information, and then you don't actually have to have had the same experience to be in a position to empathize and understand. You just have to be really good at listening and gathering that information. So I do think there's some promise there, Jerry, and our beginning research has also shown that we can reduce disproportionality of punitive discipline in places like schools that happens across race lines, because honestly, kids of color are subject to 2 biases: the external bias, the explicit bias that I've talked about today of people getting it wrong why kids misbehave, but also the implicit bias that kids of color suffer from, where people assume that their behavior is even more willful and seek more punitive responses. So I think there is some promise there.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we're on time, and I really appreciate, hearing your story and your advice. And, as a parent, having met you early on and watched you work with my own kid, I mean, you were a great guide to me. The first learning was I often had, well, I guess there are 3 choices. I saw 2: make it worse or wait till later. But it's always been very helpful, as Tangley said earlier. So thanks again, Stuart, for bringing us up to date with your work.
Well, Jerry, you're one of these folks who I say does this without knowing that they're doing it. So thank you. And thank you for your mentorship. And Tangley, let me just say that reading things like that are what help people on this Zoom continue to do this work. So thank you very much. It's incredibly meaningful to me. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And Jerry, always incredible privilege to be part of something that you're leading here. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. So it's
Welcome back, everyone, to the second half of our program, which features three terrific faculty speakers and a panel discussion moderated by Lee Cohen. Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Thomas, but first I would like to introduce to you Dr. Kamryn Eddy, who will serve as the moderator. Kamryn is co-director with Jenny of the Eating Disorders Clinical Research Program. She's associate professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, president of the Eating Disorders Research Society, and a fellow of the Academy of Eating Disorders. Welcome, Kamryn.
Thank you so much, Maurizio, for that kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today to introduce Jenny. Dr. Jennifer Thomas's groundbreaking scientific research focuses on avoidant restrictive food intake disorder and other atypical eating disorders. Throughout her stellar career here at Mass General, she's made it her mission to help children, teens, and adults with food, weight, and body issues, and especially to help those whose diagnoses may not be fully captured by the current psychiatric system. She's garnered national attention. You may have seen her on the Today Show, for example, for her book, Almost Anorexic: Is My or My Loved One's Relationship with Food a Problem? I know firsthand, as her colleague and as the co-director of the Eating Disorders Clinical and Research Program, Jenny's steadfast commitment to cutting-edge research to inform patient care. It's led her to focus on an unexplored area of eating disorders research, namely the neurobiology of individuals with eating disorders that may actually make them vulnerable to the development of these illnesses. Jenny's principal investigator on several studies investigating the neurobiology and treatment of avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, funded by the US National Institute of Mental Health and also by private foundations. She's the author and co-author of more than 140 scientific publications, and she's also the author of 2 other books: Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, Children, Adolescents, and Adults, and also the forthcoming Picky Eaters Recovery book, Overcoming Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. Jenny's Associate Professor of Psychology here at Harvard Medical School, and she's Associate Editor for the International Journal of Eating Disorders. And I'm thrilled to announce that she will assume the presidency of the Academy for Eating Disorders in June 2022. The Academy is an international professional association, the largest in our field, committed to leadership in eating disorders research, education, treatment, and prevention. I couldn't be happier to welcome my wonderful and esteemed colleague and very good friend, Dr. Jenny Thomas.
Thank you so much, Kamryn, and thank you all for having me here today. You know, growing up, I had no idea that I would grow up to become a clinical psychologist. I actually wanted to be a ballerina. So I would wear my leotard and tights under my school clothes to school so that I wouldn't miss a beat running to practice after class. I loved twirling and leaping. I've danced almost every role in the Nutcracker, ranging from an understudy for a little mouse in the battle scene all the way to the Sugar Plum Fairy. I have to say probably my favorite role was being the Sugar Plum Fairy because it's pretty awesome to wear a tutu and a tiara and be taken totally seriously at the same time. The only problem with ballet, though, is that there was a little bit of a dark side once I reached a certain age. When I was about 13, one of my coaches took me aside and said, you know, Jenny, if you just lose about 3 pounds, you'd probably be a better dancer. You could probably jump higher. You could fit into some of the costumes for the lead roles. So why don't you get to work on that? I was a little confused because I was pretty much at a normal weight at that time. I thought I was pretty healthy, but I started to get the message pretty quickly that in ballet, that wasn't necessarily acceptable or ideal in that era. a lot of my friends and peers started getting pulled aside to get the same talk. And a lot of them started dieting. Some of them even developed eating disorders that actually pulled them out of ballet. Some of them had to quit. Some of them had to go to the hospital. By the time I was 18, I had to make a decision. Would I try for this career in professional ballet, even if maybe my body type wasn't quite right for it? Or would I actually try to pursue academics? Would I go to college? So reflecting back on all of my peers who'd been so unwell with eating disorders like anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, I decided that I would take the path of going to college. And I decided to major in psychology and then go on to get my PhD in clinical psychology. And I wanted to focus on trying to help folks who had eating disorders. Got my PhD, was lucky to come to MGH and be a postdoctoral fellow and start seeing my own patients. And I was ready. I assumed that I would see a lot of patients that were kind of just like I had been, I guess, young white women who were very concerned about shape and weight and were terrified of getting fat. But what I actually found is that eating disorders come in all shapes and sizes. They come across all races and ethnicities and across the age and developmental spectrum. So I want to share a few examples of some patients that I saw early in my career that really shaped the work that I do today. One of my first patients, I'll call Sarah, was a marathon runner. I was actually referred her through the MGH emergency department where she came in for having a very low heart rate. Her hair was falling out. She was tired all the time, and she was really worried about her health. When I had my first meeting with her, I assumed that she was going to tell me that she had been on a strict diet to try to improve her running, something like might be related to the peers that I had seen in my ballet days. But actually, that wasn't it at all. You see, Sarah had celiac disease. And what happened is that she was advised to take care of herself by cutting back on gluten, which, obviously is really good care if you have celiac. But she was so afraid of getting gluten contamination and having vomiting episodes or GI distress that she actually started cutting back on other foods too that didn't have any gluten, things that she was afraid would have sneaky gluten in them. So it came to a point where she was eating only a handful of foods and could only eat foods that she herself had prepared in her own kitchen, leading to her losing just a ton of weight and being unable to do the running that she loved so much. Another patient that I saw early on in my career, I'll call James. James came in and actually was not taking any food by mouth. He was a young guy of about 12, and James was fed entirely by feeding tube. So a young boy was definitely not someone that I was expecting to see in an eating disorders clinic. And I asked him a bit about, gosh, James, what makes it so difficult for you to eat? And he said, I just don't get hungry, like ever. And I'm thinking to myself, it's almost 11 o'clock. I wonder what might be on the docket for lunch later today. So the idea of not getting hungry ever, that seems really remarkable, really surprising, very different from a lot of people's experience with food, certainly. And it seemed like maybe I had to get to the bottom of this. Then finally, another example I'll share is my patient Kojo, who I saw a bit later in my career. Kojo was an African-American man in his 30s who came in only eating 9 foods. Now, different from a lot of our eating disorder patients who might focus on eating like only fruits and vegetables, Kojo ate mostly French fries and saltine crackers. And he told me that he was really worried that other foods would have a weird texture. They'd taste disgusting. He felt like he might gag if he were to eat them. And this was really causing trouble in Kojo's life because he was, this nice single guy in his 30s, really personable, nice job, really friendly, but he hadn't gone on a dinner date in 7 years because he was so worried about what would happen if he just ordered French fries on the date. So to summarize, I didn't really know what was going on with these patients because they seemed so different from the disorders that were reflected in our diagnostic Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. But in 2013, all of that changed. A new diagnosis came out. It was like an aha moment because it felt like that diagnosis could capture so many of these patients that I was seeing along with my colleagues, including Dr. Eddy. The diagnosis was called ARFID. So it's kind of a crazy acronym. I'm going to unpack it for you. It stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. That's the acronym ARFID. And basically what it encompasses is individuals who don't eat enough food, Either they don't eat enough volume of food or they don't eat enough variety of food. And it causes problems in their life, either making them lose weight, not being able to attend social eating events, getting nutrition deficiencies, having to be dependent on supplements like tube feeding. And this is something that really was causing difficulty for people. And the thing is, just because there's a name for a disorder doesn't mean we understand, what causes it or how to treat it. So, given that I do work in such a rich environment here at Mass General, I was able to work with Kamryn to assemble a team of neuroscientists, endocrinologists, psychiatrists, and psychologists to try to figure out, hey, what's going on here? And so I want to share with you just a few results that we've gotten recently that have really helped kind of shine a light on what might be happening with these individuals that makes them at risk for ARFID. So first of all, think back to that patient, Sarah, who was just terrified of eating foods because she thought it might have gluten. We were able to do a study where we had individuals with ARFID come in after fasting overnight, and we flashed pictures of food on the screen. We thought if people were healthy, that maybe they'd have some reward circuitry activation. You're hungry, you see a hamburger, you get excited, right? But folks like Sarah, who had this fear of aversive consequences presentation of ARFID, actually had activation in their fear circuitry, seeing pictures of food. So this little subcortical structure called the amygdala, and then some other areas of the brain and the prefrontal cortex related to fear processing actually lit up. And so it seemed that, no wonder it was so difficult for her to bring on board new foods. She was getting terrified every time she would see even a picture of one, much less have to eat one. Then, I had the patient I had told you about, James, the one who really never got hungry ever. We were able to look at neuroendocrine hormones in these patients with ARFID and actually see that when they came in after an overnight fast, they had really super high levels of a satiety hormone called CCK when we compared them to healthy controls. So no wonder people like James had a difficult time getting hungry and eating. Their hormones were actually telling them that they were already full. And then finally, for patients like Kojo, who had a difficult time thinking that food would taste bitter or gross, we gave them these prop papers that was kind of like a quinine solution where we had them taste it. And it actually came to be that it tasted really bitter to folks who had that sensory sensitivity version of ARFID compared to healthy controls. So no wonder it was so hard for people like Kojo to bring on board vegetables. Things tasted really bitter and odd to him, different from how it might taste to other people. But that being said, after even finding out all of these things about ARFID in terms of the neurobiology, our patients were really grateful to take part in the studies, but they actually wanted to get better. They wanted to have a treatment, not just to be studied. So with the support of philanthropy, Kamryn and I were able to block off every Friday for a year. We would go in the conference room at the Eating Disorder Clinical and Research Program, order some takeout food, and we would roll up our sleeves and write diagrams on the whiteboard. We would talk about cases. We would try to think about, what's going to work with this one or that one? What else can we do to try to, make this treatment better? And gosh, by the end of the year, we had actually written a book that was published a couple of years ago. About 2/3 of patients now are getting better from our treatment manual. We've been lucky to train people all over the world in this cognitive behavioral treatment, and it's being translated into multiple language now, into Russian and Italian and Spanish. And so it's really just been amazing. So if you remember our runner, Sarah, through her treatment, she restored her weight, got back her period, and was finally able to run that marathon. And if you'll remember Kojo, he added 20 new foods to his diet and was finally able to get back into the dating scene. Sometimes I used to wonder if I'd made the right choice choosing psychology over ballet. But after all, I don't get to wear that tiara anymore. But now I know that I've made the right decision. At Mass General, along with my colleagues, I've been able to develop a treatment that really changes people's lives. And I didn't have to lose 3 pounds to do it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for that awesome talk. It's really cool to get to hear so much about this work. It is really interesting, right, to think about the fact that you kind of went into this field thinking that you'd see a different kind of presentation, and then that when you actually got to it, you started to see a much broader spectrum of folks with eating disorders. I'm curious, do you end up seeing some of the patients, or could you say a little bit more about the spectrum of folks that you do see within the EDCRP?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kamryn. Although a lot of my academic work does focus on ARFID, as you know, we see patients really across the whole spectrum of different diagnoses and different weights in our clinic. So a lot of young people with anorexia nervosa, kind of a disorder characterized by self-starvation, as well as bulimia nervosa, folks who are binging and purging. We see folks with binge eating disorder who feel like their eating is out of control. And then even folks with rumination disorder, where food is kind of coming back into their mouths and they're not able to control it. So, we're really privileged to see kind of the whole gamut, which I think, is also interesting with regards to your work too, because you might want to say a little bit about the crossover that you see between the disorders.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a good question too. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the diagnostic system is we kind of think about these all being singular diagnoses, but the truth is that, there's more overlap among them than anything else, right? So that even if some of the motivation for losing weight or for having difficult time eating may differ, in the treatments that we offer, we do for the low weight folks, we need to start with nutritional rehabilitation to get them on board with that first. And certainly there's a lot of diagnostic crossover, meaning that the longer that we follow people, the more that their symptom presentations may change too. People are welcome to ask any questions as well. But I know that one I often hear from families, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it, is, are there signs or things that parents should be on the lookout for? And then maybe are there things that parents could do early on, or parents or loved ones, so spouses as well, if they notice some of the signs in people who are close to them?
Sure. There are a number of different signs of eating disorders, depending on the diagnosis, but typically it would be things like rapid weight loss, or in a child, not gaining weight at different well-child visits over the years. It could be food that's missing from the cupboard or the pantry that you can't quite work out what happened to it, which suggests that maybe somebody might be binging covertly. It could be, somebody only eating a very tiny handful of foods, like I mentioned with that patient Kojo who only ate 9 foods total. So I think any of those things would be things to watch out for. I think one thing that can be tricky is a little bit of a gray area of the line between sort of normative behaviors and eating disorders. So, while like 90% of individuals are probably going to diet at some point in their lives, we know that less than 10% will develop eating disorders. So, I think you could always sort of watch for a little bit to see what happens if you're thinking somebody might go on a diet. But the moment that you're suspicious of an eating disorder specifically, I think it's really important to get help.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and I guess I might also just echo that, one of the things I think a lot of folks do is kind of tiptoe around eating disorders, so maybe just as you said, we kind of regard it as maybe a normative behavior. And then pretty quickly it can flip so that it's no longer a normative behavior. One of the things that I always encourage people to do too is, if you're concerned about something, express it directly to the person that you're worried about. And it's hard for people to be too defensive if all you're sharing is that you're concerned, coming at it from your perspective. It looks like we do have a couple of questions here too. Oh, this is a nice one. So thinking about sort of the timing of onset, for ARFID in particular, do ARFID patients have onset in childhood or adolescence? And sort of when does ARFID start? And do they persist? Do the symptoms continue?
Yeah, I love this question because I wish whoever asked it could just be sitting around the table with us at our research meetings, because we're always wondering about this. A lot of folks with ARFID do share that they've had the disorder like since childhood or even since infancy. Sometimes their parents will say they had difficulty bringing on board solid foods or changing to different infant formulas. So I think sometimes it's hard to pinpoint the exact age, but we do know for sure from our research that the onset of ARFID is much earlier than the other eating disorders, usually in early childhood, whereas the other eating disorders will onset right around puberty and adolescence. all of that being said, though, we also know, and Kamryn, I know you and I have young kids, that, usually picky eating really peaks between the ages of 2 and 6. So if you're sitting here and you have a grandchild or a child who's 4 and only wants to eat mac and cheese, that's pretty normal. And I wouldn't be too worried about ARFID yet. But if that kind of behavior does persist into later childhood or adolescence, and then is starting to get in the way of the child's, health or their abilities to socialize, that's when I would start to worry more so.
We have another great question here too. How do you suggest getting my teenagers to try vegetables? We've tried everything and they're very sensitive to texture and also to smell.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we do in the treatment, and I'll admit, I hope my kids aren't listening, but I do the same thing with them as well, is that we just give a long list of different vegetables. Sometimes kids will feel very pressured if you say, well, you have to try Brussels sprouts, or, we just made this broccoli, so you have to eat this. But if you say, all right, here are 50 different vegetables that we could learn about, no pressure, and have the child themselves, or the teenager in this case, select, okay, well, maybe I'll learn about squash, or maybe I'll learn about tomatoes or green beans. And that's great. Then you can bring a very small amount of that food, maybe not even at a mealtime and saying you have to eat this right now when you're hungry, but at a different time that's a little bit more low pressure, and ask them to learn about the food, starting with what does it look like? So say it's a tomato, is it red? Is it round? What does it feel like when you pick it up? What does it smell like? Then what does it taste like, and what's the texture like? So we kind of move up that hierarchy there, and we have an adventurous and kind of a neutral way of doing it, as opposed to putting pressure that you have to eat this particular vegetable in a large amount immediately. And usually that tends to work pretty well in the treatment.
I think it's kind of nice too. I think hearkening back to Stuart's point a little bit earlier around how important language is. Even just the way that you describe it as, do you want to learn about, or are you interested in learning about, rather than come to the table and try the Brussels sprouts. Mm-hmm. So someone else has asked here, how do GI issues, so gut imbalances and food sensitivities, appear in this population? Probably in both, eating disorders, the more typical, as well as in ARFID.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, we know from a clinical perspective that there's a ton of overlap between GI, gastroenterological disorders, as well as eating disorders. And it can kind of, it's sort of reciprocal, or can cut both ways. So both, when you're restricting your eating, it can really delay the transit of food through your GI system. And then similarly, if you already have a pre-existing disorder, like my patient that had celiac, where you have to follow sort of a restrictive diet, that can put you at risk as well. And in terms of the neurobiology, that's something that we're actively looking at, is these gut hormones, as well as the gut microbiome, and even have some preliminary data suggesting that kids with ARFID have a less diverse gut microbiome. We've been collecting stool samples from them. And that's been fascinating, because it could be that it's caused by their fairly narrow restrictive diet. But then we know that once you have a more narrow gut microbiome, it makes you crave different types of food as well. So it might be sort of a vicious cycle.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I think that it's time probably to move on to Dr. Wilens. So let me take this opportunity to introduce him. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Wilens, who will serve as moderator for our next talk by Dr. Paula Rauch. Tim also needs very little introduction, if any. He's the chief of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and he's the co-director of the Center for Addiction Medicine. He's the MGH Trustees Chair in Addiction Medicine and Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. His research interests include the relationship among attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, bipolar disorder, and substance use disorders, embedded healthcare models, and the pharmacotherapy of ADHD across the lifespan. Please join me in welcoming Tim.
Cam, thank you so very much. And Jen, that was awesome. I always learn from you. And this is just great to be here. I have to say that I really, really look forward to seeing everybody who's on the other side in person, and being snarky with you, and you being snarky with me. We miss it, and thank you for joining. Right now we're really worried about our children, especially after this year-long isolation, and now maybe even worse, the reintegration because of COVID. Kids and families are clearly stressed, creating really what is now seen as a behavioral health pediatric endemic. So how do you know what to say, and how do you know how to talk to children or grandchildren during these times of reintegration? I cannot think of anybody better to address this than Dr. Paula Rauch. Dr. Rauch is a child psychiatrist who has devoted her career to understanding and supporting the emotional health and well-being of all members of a family when one member is seriously ill. Paula, as many of you know, is the founding director of the Maurizio Parenting at a Challenging Time program, the PACT program, at the Mass General Cancer Center. The program provides free parental consultations to adult cancer patients who are facing the challenging of parenting, along with the challenges of living with cancer. It's a nationally and internationally recognized model for parent guidance and clinician education. If you need even more convincing of her expertise, she is a chief advisor to the military in this area and even the Vatican. And honestly, I feel a little bit guilty saying that, as right now I'm currently binge watching Lucifer on Netflix. Paula is an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and has practiced at Mass General since well, I'm not going to actually finish that because we're not supposed to divulge age or anything like that. I can just tell you that she and I have been working together for a long time in this institution. She's the inaugural incumbent of the Timothy Christopher Davidson Chair of Psychiatry. She's been honored with numerous clinical and teaching awards. She's a co-author of the book Raising an Emotionally Healthy Child When a Parent is Sick, along with many chapters and journal articles. She serves on the Scientific Advisory Board for the Military Child Education Coalition. And probably even more notable, when you turn on the PBS cartoon Arthur, the voice of the fox and the wisdom of the fox. So it's great. In 2019, Paula's alma mater, Amherst College, where she served as a trustee, awarded her its Medal for Eminent Service. The citation read in part, quote, "She has provided guidance on mental health issues confronting our students and our world during some of the college's most challenging time and has played an essential role in setting Amherst on a transformative path toward increased access and diversity." Paula, the first Amherst College woman to receive a medical degree, was lauded for being a visionary leader in the field of child psychiatry and an inspiring advocate for mental health. And it really nails it. So it's great honor and great pleasure to honor and welcome Dr. Paula Rauch.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's such a warm introduction. And I'm excited to be talking today about post-pandemic parenting. And even thinking about, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Do you recognize this kind of common backseat refrain from our children? The ones you hear when your child is on a long drive. We've been on this shared long and difficult pandemic journey, and many of us, adults, children, teens, we're all wondering, when will we finally get to a post-pandemic destination? So the question, are we there yet? Nope, not yet, especially not if we have children or grandchildren in our lives. And, you know, of course, that's disappointing, but it's also the good news when it comes to facilitating our children and grandchildren's resilience, and also our own, because there are important things we can be doing now before we get there that will help us all cope better when we do. And remember that how we cope as parents and grandparents and all the caring adults in a child's life affects how they cope. Their well-being is linked to ours. As you heard, I'm Dr. Paula Rauch, the founding director of the Maurizio Parenting at a Challenging Time program and the Timothy Christopher Davidson Chair of Psychiatry. Thanks to generous donors like many of you, the MGH has a center of excellence that focuses on the challenge of supporting child resilience when a parent is medically ill and sometimes, sadly, faces an untimely death. Our expert parent guidance program is integrated into the MGH Cancer Center and the Healy ALS Clinic, and we've had the privilege of partnering with thousands of grandparents and parents who are loving in helping guide them in the ways to support their children. Their children's really emotional health and well-being. Our uniquely trained child mental health clinicians basically specialize in hard conversations, the ones that include helping children understand an illness, changes in their schedules and routines, and lots of disruptions and uncertainty. And if that sounds a lot like the skills parents have needed through the past year of COVID, it's because it is. And our clinicians have been actively engaged in sharing our expertise since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's also the case that parents and children need specialized guidance for the transition from active cancer treatment to life post-treatment. And it's the lessons learned from the end of cancer treatment and the months following that transition that provide a relevant roadmap for the transition to post-pandemic parenting. The relief and happiness that so many people expect to feel after that last chemotherapy, it actually doesn't usually happen. It turns out more that it feels stressful in unexpected ways, not what was anticipated. And it's this post-treatment analogy that I'll be drawing on to talk about the challenges and opportunities for post-pandemic parenting. So our experience in any given moment is colored by a mix of our assessment of our past and our vision for our future. Good parenting, especially now, necessitates looking back and co-creating a narrative with children of where we've been this past year. Children definitely need our help to co-process this tumultuous past year with its many pandemic and also non-pandemic challenges, which just means talking together about the highs and lows of the past year. So you might ask your child or grandchild, what were some of the favorite things you did or we did as a family during this past year? And what were some of the harder things? What have you really missed doing? Children who are 10 and older are likely to have an easier time reflecting on what was harder when school first went remote in March of 2020 for most kids, and what was still harder, less hard through last fall and winter and now into the spring. While younger kids will need more help remembering what happened in the past year. Do you have photos from this past year? If you do, pull them out now. They help all of us remember. They jog specific memories and become the illustrations for a child's autobiography. And you are and want to be an important co-author on that autobiography that's getting written. So pick out the moments of adaptation and coping well. You could say, remember how disappointing it was that we couldn't celebrate Thanksgiving with grandma and grandpa, or that you couldn't have your friends over for a birthday sleepover. Then underscore the second choices that did happen. Maybe it was a Zoom holiday or a birthday celebration that was different, or maybe something entirely different, making something together. And sometimes there wasn't a good second choice, and it's resilience enhancing to be reminded that disappointment can be and was weathered. You might say, do you remember how disappointed you were or we were that we canceled our vacation or couldn't visit with our cousins? But we coped with it. Maybe there's another unrelated positive you could underscore. Maybe sleepaway camp was canceled, but there was a family trip to fish or canoe together. Maybe there weren't play dates with a friend all winter, but there were FaceTime chats or playing a shared online game. Maybe a music group that has been meeting online, not the same, but something, or a team sport has been meeting with restrictions that change the experience. That's what I mean by talking about the adaptations. Not that they made it super fun or so great that the first choice wasn't missed at all, but because importantly, it illustrates that we haven't been helpless for 16 months. We haven't lost a year. We've been creating creative workarounds and building the skills for a lifetime of increased resilience. Resilience is not being unaware that something's hard or sad or something's disappointing. It's about doing the best you can under the circumstances you've got and not giving up, not feeling helpless and alone, and continuing to invest and engage in life. We should be proud of how we've done this in the big ways and the small ways, and our children should see themselves as more capable and adaptable and stronger for all of these second choices, workarounds, disappointments, and I hope some unexpected pleasures. Do you remember the point at which you realized that this pandemic thing was going to be something unprecedented, big? Our memories tend to focus on a single experience, kind of a whoa feeling, that something is new and intense. It's really real in that moment. It's akin to first hearing one's cancer diagnosis. For these intense experiences, life changes in that moment. But becoming a long-term cancer survivor or the end of a pandemic, that doesn't happen in a flash. We're now becoming pandemic survivors, and we carry forward a new knowledge that includes having experienced disruptions, uncertainty, and different degrees of fear. Looking ahead, there'll be no off switch that gets flipped to end the pandemic. We'll experience a little less worry here, a little more freedom there, the stumbles, the setbacks, and hopefully progress to a post-pandemic experience. More of that up, down, up, down, up. You may already have had some of this experience. If you got vaccinated and you were able to safely do some things, the ones that you'd really been missing, you did them, enjoyed them, but still felt kind of worried, felt constrained, fatigued maybe, but not elated and carefree, not some sense of relief and closure, not as if the pandemic never happened. These complicated feelings associated with the end of the pandemic restrictions, or some of them, can be surprising and disappointing. Our children need to know that this full range of feelings are normal, and in fact, that transitions are really hard. We still need to exercise caution during the months ahead, and there will still be rules in place that may be hard and disappointing and often confusing or seem really unfair. Our children need to be prepared that all the things we said we'd do after COVID, like going to Disney again or Europe or going to the movies with a bunch of friends or blowing out the candles on your birthday cake with all your friends at the table, they're not suddenly going to happen on COVID is over day, because there isn't going to be one. And for some children, especially the younger ones, this is going to be a surprise, and an unwelcome surprise, even a betrayal. But you said. So now's the time to talk about this summer and next fall, and anticipate the stumbles and downs as things improve. Imagination and conversations are great agents of resilience. We don't actually know exactly how things will be, so we can imagine and wonder and make educated guesses together. Sharing honestly together about what we don't know, that supports coping. We can be creative about how to manage what's coming, because in part, we've had lots of practice from this past year. This should increase your child or grandchild's confidence, and hopefully yours too. So plan safe ways for your child or grandchild to increase social interactions with other children this summer, especially for the children who are not eager to jump back into the fray of school and after-school activities. Help that shy teen to imagine what may feel weird or uncomfortable after such a long break from hanging out together. Remind them that their peers are going to find it awkward too. They're not alone, and it will get less awkward. Talk with your anxious child about how things were not totally safe before COVID and won't be totally safe as COVID numbers dwindle. Our children trust us. Remind them we wouldn't let them do something if we didn't believe that it was safe enough. Anxious children may want to opt out of everything in person until they're vaccinated and way beyond. And you might share some of their worries, but take your own pulse and try not to amplify their worries. Like, continuing to wear a mask at school doesn't mean school's unsafe. To the contrary, masks are like seatbelts or bike helmets. We keep using them even though it's rare to be in a car accident or fall headfirst off your bike. Prepare children that different settings and different families will have different rules all through the next many, many months. Think of examples that your child already would recognize, like some children wear ski helmets and some don't. Some rollerblade with knee pads and wrist guards, but not every child does. Instead of being mad at the families that don't follow your rule set, talk about how you make safety decisions and why. This is an important teachable moment. Share your decision-making with your child and grandchild. Finally, we've each been through a difficult year, but what's made it difficult varies from family to family and child to child. The real effect of COVID on individual families, the lives of their loved ones, and the financial impact has varied enormously. And of course, the rest of life's challenges kept happening. They didn't disappear during the pandemic. To the contrary, they just piled on top of it. As we come back together, I encourage you, we need to be kind to each other, not judgmental. Be curious about what was hardest and curious to learn about what the silver linings or lessons learned may have been for others. It's an opportunity for us to model increased compassion for one another and not assume we know what others have experienced. As a nation, we absolutely need compassion and humility along with connection to thrive. I suspect our children will one day tell their grandchildren about this pandemic year. For certain, they will carry forward what they learned during this time. You have this incredible opportunity to help them write the resilient story they will tell themselves and also the one they'll tell the next generation. Be a wise co-author, one that promotes your child or grandchild's emotional health and well-being. Thank you.
Wow. Paula, that was spectacular. I have to say, every time I listen to you, and especially with this, I sort of want to have you right there in this holographic image to talk to my patients and my own kids and everybody. It's just wonderful. So I want to encourage people to put any questions you have about this or concerns or neurosis, whatever, into the Q&A, and we'd be happy to address that. So I do wonder, you cover this so well, but are there any specific types of kids, ages of kids that you're really particularly worried about during this reintegration from COVID?
So I always think of parents and grandparents as knowing their children best. So I think if parents are worried or particularly worried, they probably have a good reason to, and they need to have conversations with their go-to people that help them. So who are the kids that have had in the past more difficulty with transitions? This is a unique and really challenging transition. So I think of those kids, and I think of the kids who developmentally at some point during this disrupted time, we're going through an important transition. We heard about Cole talking about middle school. That sort of stands out often as such a difficult time. It's a time when the expectations on kids is much greater. There's a ton of social change that's going on. And if you pull a sort of tweener, a 12, 13, or 14-year-old out of their social setting, an enormous amount changes in a year. So jumping back in, their peers may be in really different places, and reestablishing a sense of comfort, getting dysregulated, as Stuart would say, is going to be more challenging. That's what's so great about the power of facilitating communication and transgenerational communication, which is fancy for talking to my grandchildren or your grandchildren and your children. It's a chance to sort of imagine together. Then it's not such a surprise. If you're prepared for things to be awkward, and if you can brainstorm together about what would make it not so difficult, that's a wonderful way to help kids to enter. True for college students as well.
Thank you. And we just have a question that just popped up, and that is, how do you recommend turning trauma to triumph post-COVID? Teenagers may not share how they're feeling about the new reopening and how their lives have really changed. And, the question is, what can you do as parents, grandparents to support them as they step back into this new normal?
So I would say that the best thing you could do is to be curious. It helps to have somebody be curious and be interested in your experience. It's a piece of empathy. But it's empathy 2.0 in that process of talking about to your child with a kind of feeling like I'm listening to learn from you. I'm not 13 now. I'm not a 15-year-old who is maybe trying to attract a new romantic partner. The kinds of challenges that our children are having, because culture has changed enormously, and even if you're 30-year-old from the perspective of your child or your teenager. So I think it's really doing that, imagining together, what might it be like, what's important. I always love asking kids, are there any kids in their orbit that they're worried about? I think often there's more bandwidth to talk about somebody else rather than talk about oneself. And so I think sometimes the child that's not so comfortable talking, ask them if there are any kids at school they think are going to have a hard time, or they see having a hard time, and why do they think that is? And then you can maybe back into wondering if that applies to your child or your grandchild.
And, one of the groups that you sort of single out a little bit is sort of these shy, these more shy, anxious kind of kids. And, do you have any sort of recommendations for helping people navigate that?
So I think for the kids, some of whom have enjoyed having less commotion around them, less social demands, or have been temperamentally shy or really struggled with anxiety, there's the process of talking about that it's reasonable to be anxious, and really trying to think about what is not anxious enough. Kids who are very anxious love to hear about kids who are not anxious at all and get themselves into trouble because they don't think about it. And you can say to them, you know, we're so lucky that you're not riding your bicycle off the top of the shed. And, you know, amazing that that child's not more anxious, but their parent is. And then talk about almost like, what does it mean to right size anxiety? Some of our colleagues, Tim, I think of Nancy Rotter, for example, who works in the allergy clinic. Kids who have food allergies need to be cautious, but she talks about, you know, some kids don't have to be so cautious about what they eat. Some kids need to be very cautious, but it's not helpful to be very, very, very cautious. It's this notion of there's a healthy amount of anxiety. So it's not pathologizing it, but helping that anxious child to move back a little bit by being less avoidant, by getting more involved, by, if they're older, thinking about what's helped them in the past, and validating what the coping strategies have been previously that have worked well, and anticipating that the first part is always hardest for them.
So this is great. And how about we have just time for one brief sort of question and response. And that is, first of all, somebody shouted out they love the comparison of masks to seat belts and bike helmets. And somebody else had put on a comment about how important this was, and that this is going to be very important. They're sending their 13-year-old to a sleepaway camp. He's nervous to go for social reasons. And sort of the punchline to the question, and again, I don't have a lot of time on this one, is how do you tell parents that sometimes the parents actually are correct, they know best about what to do, while also listening to them and supporting them with whatever fears they have? And we'll end with that question.
Well, I think sometimes you have to have a plan A and a plan B. How important is this to you? How important it is to your child? What's their escape hatch if it's a 6-week sleepaway experience and 2 weeks into it, or at visiting day, it's really terrible. Maybe this is the time when you're going to adapt differently and say, I think it's important that you have this experience. Some of the things that we think we won't like, it turns out we like them. And some of the things we think we won't like, we were correct. And now we will know going forward that actually this is not something that I like to do. And weathering frustrations, disappointments, rotten experiences, that's part of actually increasing confidence. And I would say to the previous question about the difference between what I think of as a challenge or a trauma, traumas are experienced feeling alone and not in dialogue, not with somebody empathic to your challenge. And challenges, I don't know all the way to triumph, but good coping is more about feeling like you're processing it together, that you don't feel hopeless and helpless and alone with it, and feel like the things that can be changed or modified, that someone is going to help you do that, but not count you out by saying, if it makes you anxious, don't do it. Never go into the swimming pool. Helping you to engage with support.
Well, Paula, thank you so very much. I think everybody really, as always, gained so much from your words and your responses, and it's just wonderful. And thank you so much. We'd like to move forward, and I'd like to introduce the moderator of our final presentation. This is Dr. Derri Shtasel. Derri is a friend. She's a critical colleague, a talented advocate with a big ADV. That's capital letters in our department. She's the Associate Chief for Public and Community Psychiatry, Director of Public and Community Psychiatry, and the Michelle and Howard Kessler Chair. If you know Derri around here and you know our residency and stuff, she is like a whole, in a positive way, cult following of our residents and fellows. You know, they really look to her for guidance and advice. If you go to her office, there's this line outside her office at any given time. She's truly talented and really an inspiring educator. She's an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and is also, if she's not busy enough doing all of this, is a clinician with Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. Almost good afternoon, but good morning, Derri.
Thank you. That was extremely generous and very kind. Can Alzheimer's disease be prevented is the topic of today's talk by Dr. Yakeel Quiroz. Finding the answer to that question is her life's work. Yakeel's a neuropsychologist at Mass General, studying the neural underpinnings of memory loss in Alzheimer's disease. By applying her efforts to the world's largest family with a genetic mutation that causes early onset Alzheimer's, They live in Colombia, where Yakeel was born and raised. Her research has provided evidence of brain abnormalities in individuals at genetic risk for Alzheimer's decades before they have symptoms. Her findings have helped the field to reconceptualize Alzheimer's as the sequence of changes that begins many years before cognitive decline and which may be targeted by promising disease-slowing treatments at a time in which they might have their most profound effect. Yakeel joined Mass General in 2012 as a predoctoral intern in neuropsychology and then stayed as a postdoctoral fellow. She was awarded a highly competitive NIH Director's Pioneer Early Independence Award that allowed her to become a faculty member at Mass General and Harvard Medical School. The award also provided her the resources to launch the Columbia-Boston biomarker study known as COLBOS and to establish her own lab, the Familial Dementia Neuroimaging Lab. Yakeel's research was recognized in 2020 by the Alzheimer's Associations with an award for the most impactful research in Alzheimer's biology in the past 2 years. Today, she will talk about her breakthrough study of a Colombian woman with a mutation that protected her from dementia, even though her brain developed a major neurologic feature of Alzheimer's. A story in the New York Times said this about the research. It provides an answer, one that experts say could change the scientific understanding of Alzheimer's disease and inspire new ideas about how to prevent and treat it. It is a distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Yakeel Quiroz.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to share some of the work that we are doing in the lab. First of all, I had to say that I'm very excited by everything that I have learned this morning. It has been great to hear all the work that is happening in the department. So thank you for the opportunity of that too. And an Alzheimer's researcher, I had to say that today is a very special day for Alzheimer's. I have been getting all these text messages that the FDA just approved actually the first treatment for Alzheimer's disease in nearly 20 years. So yeah, so it's a very exciting day for Alzheimer's research. I just wanted to say that even before starting with my presentation, because it's a very historic day for Alzheimer's. And I have been doing Alzheimer's research for almost 20 years. So I have been working with patients and families with Alzheimer's disease since I was in college. And sorry for all the text messages, I apologize in advance. So since I was in college, I started working with these families. For me, as I was saying, almost 20 years ago. And I still remember some of the questions and the conversations that I had with some of the professors back then, and asking some of the questions, similar questions that I still get today from my patients, and some of them related to treatment. Is there any treatment for the disease? Can we prevent it? Is there anything that we can do to stop it? I had to say that Alzheimer's disease is just a terrible disease. And the way that I see, and I always say it, it takes away what I consider to be our greatest treasures in life. You know, it takes away our memories. It takes away our personal identity, and it takes away our independence. And, you know, witnessing all of this at early age and college really made a very lasting impression on me. And I decided even at that age that I wanted to dedicate my life and my career to do everything that I could to helping to find a cure for the disease. And as it was mentioned during the introduction, I was raised and I was born and raised in Colombia. And something that you may know now is that in Colombia, we actually have what is known as the world's largest family with early onset Alzheimer's disease. We have identified so far more than 6,000 individuals with this form of the disease. About half of them, they actually have a genetic form of the disease that leads them to develop Alzheimer's and memory loss in their 40s. So they have memory loss in their 40s. They usually develop dementia in the 50s. And unfortunately, they usually die in their 60s. And so far, we don't have any formula to stop the disease. So there is no treatment for them. And everything that we have been doing in the past several decades, it has been a new opportunity and a new window into Alzheimer's disease. my group and with the collaboration in Colombia, we have been able to study the brains of these individuals in a way that is very unique, because we have been able to study individuals with no symptoms, individuals that we know almost with 100% certainty that they will develop Alzheimer's and dementia in the future, but we have been studying several years before they have any symptoms. So as a matter of fact, like my group actually have identified some changes even in children, like 30 years, 40 years before they have any symptoms, which it has been actually being critical to even thinking now about ways to think about primary prevention in the future. And all the work that we have been doing in the past several years has given us this opportunity to actually think about like changes that go with age and changes that can give us this path for prevention, right? So we know this age-related trajectory or brain changes that go all the way from asymptomatic stages to symptomatic stages, and that can help us to predict who are the individuals that have greater risk to develop Alzheimer's disease and dementia in the future, which all of this has been critical to develop more sensitive ways to identify individuals at risk, to develop biomarkers of the disease. And of course, all of this is great for science, it's great for identifying people for clinical trials, but it doesn't provide like concrete solutions for treatments or for direct ways to prevent the disease. In 2016, as part of these efforts and the quest for, as I call it, the quest for Alzheimer's prevention, something quite extraordinary happened, and something that gave us this like big push in our work with the families in Colombia. So we actually identified one extraordinary individual from these Colombian families who, despite carrying this genetic mutation, the same genetic mutation that I was telling you that leads them to develop memory in their 40s and Alzheimer's in the 50s. She didn't develop Alzheimer's in the 40s. She only developed memory complaints and dementia in her 70s. And we brought her to Boston. We tried to figure out what was going on with her, why she didn't have these problems. And we found that her brain was very different from all the other brains that we have seen. We found that she had really high levels of amyloid, that is one of the proteins that goes bad in the disease. And she didn't have the other protein that is causing the disease, that is tau pathology. And we found for the first time ever that whatever she had that was protecting her against Alzheimer's disease and dementia was related to this disconnection between amyloid and tau. So for the first time, she was offering us this new hope for treatments and the new hope for new avenues for treatments in general. So now our work is pretty much trying to translate what she had, what was protecting her for memory impairment and dementia into new therapeutics. So we are now developing new antibodies that pretty much mimic what she had, that is related to a new mutation that we found that she had in a gene that is called ApoE Christchurch mutation. And we are trying to translate that to bring it to the protection to other individuals as well. So we are finding now that individuals like Donna Lydia, that is this case that we are finding, is actually bringing us closer to that prevention to Alzheimer's disease. And after her, we have been able to identify other protected cases in these families from Colombia that also are bringing us closer to that path for prevention of Alzheimer's disease. So going back to the initial question of my presentation, can Alzheimer's disease be prevented? I will say, oh yes, I think that we are very close to that. And I think that all this work that we have been able to accomplish with Donna Lydia, with the protected cases and with the cases from Colombia are pretty much bringing us very close to that path for prevention and for more treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Not just for the families and for the patients in Colombia, but also for families and patients around the world. So thank you very much.
Yakeel, this is such exciting and really hopeful work. Based on this work, how soon do you think we might actually see something that you're describing, this way to intervene to prevent Alzheimer's disease?
So yeah, so the work that we are doing, like for instance, based on what we were able to identify with Donna Aliria, we are now like in the process of, as I mentioned, so we are able to develop these antibodies that pretty much mimic the functions of this new mutation that is the ApoE Christchurch mutation. And so, yeah, so pretty much we are in the first stage, is want to put it away, of this preclinical development of the drug. So the answer is yes. So pretty much I think that we are going to be able to see a drug based on the protective mechanism that we found on her. So the question that remains is how soon we will be able to see it. And I think that the answer to that is like, is more based on like how much resources we have to actually get to that point. Because like from what we call from bedside, from bench to bedside, it's pretty much like in the preclinical, in this preclinical development, is more a matter of like how fast we can actually get it to clinical trials in humans. And so, yeah, it's a matter of how much resources we had to get it to that point. So, but yeah, so I think that all the evidence that we have right now is very strong and suggests that this may in fact work. We have the best evidence that in this individual, it was actually able to delay cognitive impairment by 30 years. And it was something that I was not able to mention in the presentation. She actually passed away last year in November, and she didn't die of dementia. So I mean, like she actually was able to beat a dementia. So she didn't die of dementia.
Let's maybe we just shift gears for a minute, because I'm guessing everyone has some curiosity about this. So just tell us a little bit about kind of what was behind your interest in high school, in the brain, the young woman in Colombia, kind of what drives you to do this work?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Colombia, but more specifically, I'm originally from Medellin and from Antioquia. So pretty much like we are from the same regions that I'm from the same regions that these families I'm from. And growing up, I was also growing up as part of I grew up in the same violence that Colombia and Medellin and Cartel de Medellin and all of the drug violence was part of that, I don't know, we call it like period or violence and stuff. And in high school, I was very interested in understanding how the brain was actually, if the brain was actually playing a role or not in the violent behavior. And so that was kind of my motivation to go to college and psychology in particularly, and my motivation to go to neuroscience. And when I went to neuroscience in college, so the only group that was actually doing neuroscience research in the whole town was actually a group that was doing neuroscience in Alzheimer's disease. So that's kind of like how I connected to the Alzheimer's disease in the first place. And I joined the group of neuroscience since my junior year. So it was pretty much there. And since my junior year, I was connected to Alzheimer's disease. The first motivation in high school was trying to understand the role of neuroscience and the violent behavior.
Thank you. So someone has asked this question. Do you think that this preventive mechanism exists in people who don't have the gene for early onset familially related Alzheimer's?
That's a really good question. And we already tested that like in vitro, and the answer is yes.
That's very exciting to hear. So can you just paint a picture for us? I mean, what would the impact of this be when we have this? How will it change the landscape broadly?
So yeah, so first of all, this is the mutation that she has is, like I mentioned really fast in the presentation, but the mutation is the ApoE3 Christchurch. So it's a mutation in the ApoE. So ApoE is a gene that has been linked to risk and Alzheimer's disease in the general population. So it's a very important gene, not just for Alzheimer's disease, but it's a very important gene for many different other functions, including cardiovascular risk factors and many other functions as well. So it's a very important gene in general. So the impact is really high. And it's also like a gene that has been studied before for treatments, and it was very popular back in the, also like in the 90s. And I don't know, for some reason, people stopped paying attention to ApoE for some reason. But now it's like it's gaining more attention. And hopefully, like we published all these findings in 2019, and you can see, like, even for the number of citations that our paper has received since we published, that people are already paying attention to the gene again. So hopefully this will actually bring new treatments, not just like the ones that we propose, but also new treatments related to ApoE.
You know, something I think probably lots of us here today worry a little bit about is what happens as we get older, and this challenge of not remembering people's names or kind of things that seem to happen. Can you just say a word or two about the difference between some of the cognitive changes that happen with what we call sort of normal aging and those that are much more concerning and suggest the beginning of the dementia process?
Yeah, one of the main, memory in general changes with aging, and what we call changes with aging is like, I would say, like after 25, everything changes with aging. But one of the main concerns is when the changes actually start interfering with your ability to function in daily activities. You know, when you actually start noticing that your forgetfulness or it impacts the way that you function in every day. So that already raises the concerns to a different levels. So that's something to keep in mind, keep track. When you notice that you start forgetting things, but that impacts the way that you function every day. So that's already, yeah, you should consult with your PCP or with you, if you have a neurologist, with your neurologist, because that's different from normal age.
Thank you. So I guess the fact that we're all here, we can be a little bit reassured for the moment in this area. Just for a minute or two, can you just share with us how you talked about the difference and what's novel in this? Do you have thoughts about, are there other people in this area? How are you going to take the next steps forward to pursue the tau hypothesis that you talked about?
So one of the things that, and this, and I, of course, I didn't have time to mention everything there. Like, for instance, something that we noticed, and we are now like writing a paper like with the follow-up of the work that we did with her. Like, she actually, first of all, she was like a very devoted patient to research. She was really involved in the work that we did with her, and she was always very committed to help with everything that she could with the research projects that we have. So she came back for follow-up like 2 years after the baseline. Like, for instance, now we are writing out the results for the follow-up, and even like she and her family donated her brain after she passed. So like we are also doing some analysis with her brain with the postmortem findings. And like with the follow-up and the brain, it has been very interesting because we have like two other pieces of the puzzle in terms of the protection, which is very key for understanding that neuroprotection. And for the follow-up, for instance, we can see that it's very interesting that this connection that I briefly mentioned between how the tau pathology, that is the protein that goes, one of the proteins that goes bad in Alzheimer's disease, she was very protected in the way that how tau propagates in the brain. So the regions of the brain that are very important and critical for memory, they were very preserved from that tau pathology. So somehow it's kind of like, yeah, tau didn't touch them. And that was something that you can see in the follow-up in vivo, but the same like and the postmortem data as well. When we actually looking at her brain postmortem, we can also observe that protection. So pretty much, yeah, so that disconnection between the amyloid, she had amyloid everywhere in her brain, but somehow tau, the protection is very specific to tau. So tau didn't touch these brain regions that are important for memory. So which I think that is quite remarkable. And yeah, is we can somehow replicate that even like closer to other individuals, that will be amazing. Not just for Alzheimer, but also for other tauopathies, other diseases that impact tau as well. It will be great for the patients.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that process of inquiry so we understand actually how one does explore and then test these hypotheses. But frankly, thank you for doing this work. It's inspiring, and I think it gives all of us a lot of hope. We're going to switch gears for a moment now, and it's time for our panel discussion, which will be moderated by Dr. Lee Cohen. I'm guessing everyone here knows Lee. Lee is the founder and director of the Amon Pinizzato Center for Women's Mental Health, the Associate Chief of Psychiatry for Philanthropy and Department of Communications, and the Edward N. and Carol M. Carpenter Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Lee, I don't think you need further ado. Please take it from here.
Hey, thanks, Derri. We are going to actually switch over to Zoom format versus webinar format. And so people will be able to sort of raise their hand. They can continue to use the chat function. Let me first sort of say that it is terrific to look at the sort of our attendee list and see, folks that have been joining us for many, many years, to see both sort of new and new names, as well as folks who've been, sort of supportive of our work and our passion for many, many years. I also want to say that this year we switched it up a little bit. I think it was obvious, but it's terrific to see people popping into the Zoom room. We decided to not do slides, to have people talk about their passion for their clinical work, their research, for some to talk a little bit about in the context of the pandemic. It was inspiring. Cole Kessler, thank you for your courage and your willingness to tell your story. I've heard you several years ago, and to sort of get an update, it was really terrific. And from all of my colleagues and all of the attendees, my sincere and our sincere thanks. And also, it's been a long 14 months, and having the esprit as I look across this Zoom room of colleagues that I've known for a long time. Stu, when you still look very young, but you looked even younger. It's terrific. And we really hope that in 2022, we'll be in person. We can continue to use the chat function if that's most comfortable for people, or people can ask a question directly. And so several have already come in. And so I'm going to just sort of start taking them on the fly here. Ellen, there was a question that came in for you. It was terrific. And so Ellen, you and I have shared patients over the years, and a couple come to mind where, actually, after they've worked with you, they do have a sense of sort of the issue with respect to processing speed that you spoke about this morning, but they also talk a little bit about demoralization, and sort of, and it's not just about executive function. It's about a sense of sort of, you commented a little bit about an awareness that something is off in terms of how they take in and process information, and they get demoralized. And I was curious, in your clinical work with these folks, how you address that and how folks deal with that.
It's very, very much a common problem, because these kids and young adults have heard their entire life many, many times in every day, hurry up, why are you taking so long, what's wrong with you? And adults say these sorts of things to kids all the time without even thinking about it. So that feeling of that they're not ever quite fast enough becomes I'm not good enough and what's wrong with me. And it becomes a much bigger issue about self-esteem. The important thing, and a lot of people talked about this today, is finding that resilience. And resilience is really your ability to say, okay, I've been through this tough spot. Now I have the power to change that. And the way they have the power to do that is through self-understanding and helping others to empathize with them. And the only way you can really help someone to empathize with what you're going through is to be able to articulate that, to be able to talk about your story in a coherent fashion. And so part of the treatment actually is to help them verbalize what their life story has been like and what they then need from the people in their environment. And that slowly can help someone feel much more empowered. And that builds up sort of that resiliency, that muscle of resiliency, and that, oh, I told my story to someone else and they responded in a different way to me than they had in the past. And so being able to articulate, what is it that I need? Who am I? Actually is part of the most important part of treatment.
Hey, thanks so much. Stu, a question came in for you, and it was a great talk. And you know, I've heard you talk a little bit about your experience with the NYPD, and that's such a powerful vignette. But I'm going to sort of push you a little bit and talk about, you know, because if folks can sort of get on the same page about, you know, it's not that someone doesn't sort of want to, it's that they cannot, but that you talked a little bit about how much of this issue of dysregulation sort of mediates that. And sort of, I thought that you would just say a little bit more about how important that is, but how that gets managed, because it seems like if the dysregulation doesn't get managed and someone wrote that in, then you sort of can't get where you need to be. And so I thought maybe you could talk just a little bit more about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think it's you know, it links to exactly what Ellen was just talking about. Reminded me of something that my grandfather, who is 104, often says to me. He says, if you give a dog a name, eventually they will answer to it. Which is to say, if you tell a kid that, you know, they're not quick enough or lazy, aren't trying hard enough, we should not be surprised when, you know, they start to sort of embrace that view of themselves and look like and talk like and act like someone like that. So, you know, the power of how we communicate what we understand the issues to be is crucial. And it relates to dysregulation because, frankly, if you're sort of branded that way, it's hard to sort of stay calm in interactions and relationships where people are completely misunderstanding you. But I think, you know, broadly, to get back to your specific question, Lee, you know, there's a bunch of different ways to manage dysregulation, and it can be managed behaviorally, it can be managed pharmacologically, and this is why, you know, with kids or adults who suffer from severe difficulties managing, regulating their emotions, it's why we really need to be collaborating with colleagues, because you're going to need all hands on deck to figure out ways to sort of decrease that dysregulation that is occurring. I think that the thing I wanted to try to counter in my talk today is that people often have this view that if somebody is too dysregulated, they're inaccessible and you can't possibly work with them, and certainly talking to them is not going to bring them down. And that's actually not accurate, because words, as I mentioned, are a very powerful regulator. And even when somebody's screaming at you, it's amazing. What you say back has a lot to do with whether they continue to escalate or they come down. And what we tell people, parents and others, is in the heat of the moment, really just do two things. Reflect anything that somebody is saying to you, even shut the hell up and get away from me, and reassure them that you're just trying to understand what's going on and trying to be helpful. And if you can do those things, you'll actually find that you can, in the moment of dysregulation, help regulate people.
Well, I'll keep that in mind the next time that when I'm trying to check into a hotel and they can't find my hotel reservation, that I'm going to work on that
Well,
because
Lee, all kidding aside, I'm sure everybody here has been on the receiving end of some manufactured empathy that came out of a poor employee training, where the person who's checking you in says, "Well, I'm really sorry to hear that, Mr. Cohen. I feel very badly." And you're like, "Oh, Jesus." But if the empathy is delivered actually genuinely, it really does have a calming effect. It really does. So, and I can attest to this in little interactions in my own life. I remember walking over to Whole Foods and having a really terrible day. And the person said to me, they said, "How's it going?" And I actually decided to be honest for once. Instead of saying fine or good, how are you? I said, "Actually, I'm having a really crappy day." And you know what they said to me? They said, "I'm actually really sorry to hear that. I hope your day gets better. I hope it's not too bad." And it was genuine. And you know what? I felt my entire system come down some. Empathy, very powerful regulator.
Hey, Stu, thank you so much. Jenny, a question came in. I thought it was a terrific question. And also I want to invite all of our attendees to either pop questions into the chat or raise your hand and we'll recognize you. But Jenny, these were actually two very cool questions and not related, but I'm going to pitch them both. One of the attendees commented sort of, it's so cool that you have been devoting the amount of time, both on the science side, on the clinical side, to ARFID. But it was really more about sort of, do people grow out of it? I mean, because you talked a little bit about onset, but in terms of, does the syndrome shift over time as people get older? Sort of what happens to that marathon runner as she sort of gets older? And do we have data that informs that?
That's such a great question. Thanks for asking. So we actually have a longitudinal study where we've been following folks over time. So we have about 2 years worth of data so far, and it does look like some people will go into like spontaneous remission without treatment, but some people will really persist in their illness, actually a large number without treatment. So that's why we feel like it's so important to get the treatment out there. And the other thing that we're trying to do is sort of educate our colleagues, for example, pediatricians, because there is that normative picky eating that people will sort of grow out of. And so sometimes families will get, the message, "Oh, don't worry about this ARFID, they're going to grow out of it." But there is really a subset of kids who will not grow out of it, and they're really in need of help.
And actually, this is not really a follow-up, but I thought, and this question actually did come in. Someone asked about sort of the extent to which this research in this space has gone global, and someone wrote, are there women or men in France who will only eat croissants and a little bit of brie, and that's it? And so, or something, but like a variation on that theme. Does ARFID go global?
It totally goes global. I'm so glad you asked. So I don't have any colleagues in France yet, although Kamryn and I would love a trip to Paris. So if anyone wants to hook us up, that'd be great. But we do have colleagues all over the world. And so what we have heard is that, for example, in Mexico, a lot of kids with ARFID, they only will eat like rice and tortillas and beans. They don't want to eat other stuff. In Netherlands, there's like a special kind of croissant chocolate pastry that a lot of the kids will eat and only eat that. And so it's actually, I'm glad you asked, because one of the kind of thought experiments we do with the kids in our clinic is we say, hey, if you were born in another country, some of the preferred foods that you have now would be like totally, different to you, they wouldn't be your preferred foods. They'd be totally unfamiliar. Think about if you grew up somewhere else, like maybe you'd be eating like beans and rice. So I think sometimes that helps to get them a little flexible. I will say though, that there are similarities in the preferred foods. They tend to be sort of like processed carbohydrate grain type of foods, even if they're a little different by the culture.
Jen, thanks so much. Yakeel, there was a question also that had come in sort of as an extension of the last question that Derri was asking a little bit is, as you think about the future of this work, when we think bench to bedside, is there interest? We're familiar, we saw CNN in terms of even the controversy about bringing this drug to market for Alzheimer's, the level of interest by the pharmaceutical company in sort of taking what's going on at the bench forward?
You mean for the Christchurch?
Yes, yeah. Is there enthusiasm? Are there, I mean, the sorts of, you're one lab in one corner of the world. Is there a lot of interest in terms of by pharmaceutical companies that's in play to sort of take basic science and towards drug development and hopefully mitigation of what is a devastating disease?
Yeah, I think that, so the general picture of clinical trials is one story. I think that what we have with this unique case is like a different story in the sense, like we have the best evidence that we have one patient, like Primas is not just taking something and bringing it to the clinical trials. We actually have one individual that is like a piece of evidence, somebody that actually already showed us that having this mutation actually allowed her to live 30 years without having impairment. You know what I'm saying? It's not just taking one drug and bring it to clinical trials. It's actually having somebody that actually is like, for me, is the best evidence. Somebody who actually lived 30 years without impairment. It's not just thinking that this is gonna be something that is a drug and see if this is gonna work or not. That is usually the way the clinical trials are based. So it's like, for me, I don't know, I think that for me, that's the best evidence, having somebody, the life evidence for somebody that actually lived without impairment.
Hey, thank you, Yakeel. Paula, there were two, the comment and there was a question. You know, what I loved about your talk was you talk about this sort of metaphor of storytelling and that it can take sort of people from feeling somewhat powerless to feeling empowered as a function of how that story gets told. That's such a cool message, I think, which sort of I took away from your talk. But the question was really about, it's not one size fits all as we make this transition out of the pandemic, particularly with kids and kids who are so different. They're different developmentally and some of the challenges they have. And so the question was, like, on the fly, as we're doing this transition, how will parents adapt? How will teachers adapt? Because kids are going to be making these transitions either more or less easily or more or less quickly. And I wonder if you could speak to that some.
So many challenges that we face are challenges that some among us have experience with. What's unique about this is that you have to be in your hundreds when the world was a different place to have actually lived through a pandemic. Schools weren't the same, media wasn't the same, Zoom certainly wasn't available. So really what we're all doing is taking mosaic chips and saying, okay, based on this past experience and that past experience, my evidence-informed view on this is likely to go a little this way, likely to go a little that way. And mostly what I would say is it's going to be hit or miss. Going back to school in the fall, I actually initially was surprised that there was a push to get kids sort of quickly back to school for the last little bit. But now that it has occurred and there was a lot of disruption about it, I actually think that it was sort of a trial size of being re-embedded into your social network. And I think it was a great idea. I didn't, through the 2020 hindsight scope, I think what a good idea. Because we now have had a little bit of experience, we have something that we can talk about with kids, what this sort of 6 weeks period was like. And I think things that are mysterious have the most uncertainty baked into them. And so I think it is, parents can do some reconnaissance as their child goes to camp or is going back to school or is restarting soccer, whatever it is, to talk to whoever is the rule setter or the set of rule setters. The more details you can have about what to expect, there's going to be plenty that nobody can predict. But I think people often underestimate the power of knowing what's not going to happen as much as what might happen. And then there's going to be the adjustment piece. And if we are all prepared that we're going to bumble through this next time, kids are going to be wildly differently prepared at school, depending on what this time was like for them. We're going to need to do planning that is partially on the fly. Parenting anyway is on the job training, and parenting through a pandemic is absolutely on the job training. But the narrative that runs through it, the storytelling, this idea that each of us is writing an autobiography that we are constantly editing, part of what we want is not to be in the role of a story that makes one the victim, but a story in which one is empowered to change what you can change and bear what you can't, all in the service of increasing confidence.
That is so helpful. I had occasion over the weekend to go to a restaurant, and while we're in this middle ground, it was so interesting to see some people were wearing masks, some people were not wearing masks. People didn't have to, but there seems to be, whether you're a kid or whether you're an adult, just extraordinary variability with sort of this transition, with behavior around this transition. And if we're seeing that in adults, obviously we're going to see it in kids where they don't have as much miles on their shoes, as it were. These have just been amazing questions. We are actually we're coming close to the wrap-up time. I want to thank you all again for your participation, for your wisdom, for your collegiality. It's really a privilege to moderate and to hang out with you all. But I'm going to pitch it back to Maurizio to sort of wrap us up this morning. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Lee. And thank you to the faculty presenters, the moderators, and Cole Kessler for making today's event such a success. And we're grateful to Donna and Patty Ribakoff and the Leadership Council for their support today and every day. I hope you found this year's virtual visiting day to be inspiring as well as informative. We are excited for all that lies ahead and to continue the mission of the Department of Psychiatry to increase access, to expand outreach, and share knowledge in new and innovative ways. And above all, to provide the best care for our patients informed by groundbreaking clinical research. We look forward to meeting in person next time. In the meanwhile, have a wonderful summer and join the company of friends and loved ones. Thank you very much.